Hi, welcome to a new episode of History in 7 Facts. In this show, we'll explore interesting and intriguing episodes from humanity's past, from the ancient times all the way to the modern era. What is history? Is it a record of past events? That's how we perceive it, but it's not exactly right. Just think about this one question. Who writes the history books? Is it the winners or the losers? There aren't many nations that admit to have conquered someone else. Most say that they've liberated or civilized them. Do not be fooled. History is written by the victors. Tyrants can be transformed into brave leaders, and entire chapters, events, and people can be erased. In war, victory is always justified. Those who win always believe that their success is proof that the other one was wrong. In reality though, war is a lot more complex than that, and it's actually quite hard to justify death and destruction on such large scales. So the way events are written down completely depends on when and who writes it. Just remember this: no matter what you know, keep in mind that it's not the whole truth. I'm gonna give you 3 examples of how history is shaped by the victors. Here's the first one. During the 16th century, Spain was on its way to conquer South America. Hernán Cortés was on his way to conquer Mexico in the north, while Francisco Pizarro captured Peru. We know today that these conquests were not at all gentle. But in those days, the Spanish soldiers were considered liberators by European scholars. Back then, most chronicles were written by clergymen, so obviously they were excited by the fact that Christianity, and Catholicism in particular, was spreading around the world. But when the Native American nations started to write down their own accounts of the events, they weren't so kind with their words. From their point of view, these European soldiers were a disaster. Cortés was described as a ruthless and bloodthirsty conqueror, while Pizarro was the thug who killed their emperor, Atahualpa. So, who's right? Well, of course, it's more complicated than that. The Inca Empire was a military theocracy, not too different from Spain's political regime. And in Mexico, the Aztecs were practicing human sacrifice as a show of faith, and they, in turn, were persecuting other smaller tribes. So which version of history is the real one? You may not have heard of William Rufus, better known as William II of England. He ruled his kingdom in the beginning of the 11th century. For a very long time, and perhaps even today, he was considered to be the most evil king in the country's history. He used to rob churches, was short-tempered, and he worshipped Satan. How do we know that? Clergymen of the time wrote about him in the time of Henry I, who followed William on the throne. But today, this image of a mad king has been changed. In fact, today most historians regard him as a wise and cunning leader and a great general. He gave the most important positions in the church to his most trusted courtiers, but this meant that the church had lost most of its influence and money. This can now easily explain why chronicles of the time portrayed William as a faithless ruler. His death was also no accident. Those same chronicles say that he died while hunting. An arrow ricocheted in a tree and hit him. Unlikely. Because you see, someone else participated in that same hunt. His brother, Henry Beauclerk, who would soon be known as King Henry I. So is history written by the victors? During the 1st century, a Roman Jewish historian, Yosef ben Matityahu, wrote about Emperor Vespasian's assault on Jerusalem. In this account, the Jews were portrayed as the victims of bad weather. He said that a divine wind blew against the Jews, stopping their arrows from reaching the Romans, but helping the Roman arrows reach them. The wind was so strong that they couldn't even see or stand up straight, so they could not see the Romans approaching them. And that's why they lost the battle, and not because of the Roman conquerors. He had his reasons to avoid portraying the Roman army as an evil conquering machine. He wanted to convince his fellow Jews to accept Roman rule. During the First Jewish-Roman War, he fought against them and was captured in Galilee. He was supposed to die, but he managed to convince Vespasian, who was then still a general, that he would become the emperor. Later on, Vespasian did indeed become the emperor, so he set Joseph free. Joseph moved to Rome and changed his name to Flavius Josephus. As George Orwell said, "Who controls the past, controls the future. Who controls the present, controls the past." During World War II, Japan's brutal militarism shocked the world. And yet, in a similar fashion to a practice in the United States, today the public school texts do not portray that period in such a bad light. I said similar to the United States because even today their textbooks do not reveal the full extent of the brutality of the westward advance through North America, which swept aside hundreds of American Indian nations. Japan conquered much of Asia but ultimately lost its war against more formidable and experienced forces. Now, that period in Japan's history has been again and again the subject of controversies, because again and again there has been an effort to whitewash the actions of the empire during those years. Now don't get me wrong, incidents like the rape of Nanking, the experiments of Unit 731 and the comfort women are being mentioned, people do know about it. But ever since the war has ended, there's been an ongoing battle as to how these events are portrayed. Winners, not losers, write the history books intended to instruct the next generation. That's why no matter where you get your education from, no matter who tells you what, take it with a grain of salt. The father of history is considered to be Herodotus, who in the 5th century BC wrote his account of the Persian Wars. Historiography has been a major interest of the Chinese. Hence, of all nations in the world, China has the longest and most voluminous record of its past. Reading and writing history was always an integral part of Chinese learning, and it still continues to be. But it also has to be. We need a record of where we've come from, so to know where we're going. But even so, as Aldous Huxley once pointed out, the most important of all lessons that history has to teach is that men do not learn very much from the lessons of history. If you look closely, you'll see that history does repeat itself, again and again. So then, who's right? Everybody. And nobody. We all need to think for ourselves and decide what is fact and what is fiction. By its very nature, history is one of the most difficult sciences to be defined with precision. Any attempt to reveal past events and create an account of it is almost impossible without bringing in personal views. So who writes the history books? The victors or the vanquished? If the vanquished is totally destroyed, it's unlikely we'll ever know their version of history. But if remnants of the defeated survive, we can expect to see another view of the same event. But they're both just points of view. But in all honesty, most of the times we get to read history as described by the victors. Think about it. We never ever get to read about the bravery of the German soldiers during World War II, but we do get a huge overdose of how inhumane those same soldiers were. But do you honestly believe that there were no events of bravery, camaraderie and heroism among the Germans too? History is the result of the historian's imagination. It's a collection of facts, loaded with added events and intentionally forgotten chapters. It's storytelling based on real events. Thank you for watching this episode of 7 Facts. If you liked this video, please thumbs up and subscribe. While you're downstairs, let me know what you think about this video. Please consider visiting my Patreon page and become a patron. The link is in the description. I hope to see you next time. Bye.